The Life of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus by Plutarch. Translated by Aubrey Stewart. Having finished the first history, it remains to contemplate equal calamities in the pair of Roman lives, in a comparison of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus with Agis and Cleomenes. Tiberius and Gaius were the sons of Tiberius Gracchus, who was censor and consul twice, and celebrated 2 triumphs, but was still more distinguished for his personal character, to which he owed the honor of having for his wife Cornelia, the daughter of Scipio, the conqueror of Hannibal, whom he married after Scipio's death. Though Tiberius had not been a friend of Scipio, but rather a political opponent. A story is told that Tiberius once caught a couple of snakes in his bed, and the diviners, after consulting on the matter, told him that he must not kill both, nor yet let both of them go. As to the male, they said, if it were killed, the death of Tiberius would follow, and if the female were killed, Cornelia would die. Now Tiberius, who loved his wife and thought it would be more suitable for him to die first, as he was an elderly man, and his wife was still young, killed the male snake and let the female go. And he died no long time after, leaving 12 children by Cornelia. Cornelia undertook the care of her family and her husband's property, and showed herself so prudent, so fond of her children, and of so exalted a character, that Tiberius was judged to have done well in dying in place of such a wife. And though Ptolemaeus, the king of Egypt, invited Cornelia to share his crown, and wooed her for his wife, she refused the offer, and continued a widow. All her children died before her, except one daughter, who married the younger Scipio, and 2 sons, of whom I am going to speak, Tiberius and Gaius, who were brought up by their mother so carefully that they became, beyond dispute, the most accomplished of all the Roman youth, which they owed, perhaps, more to their excellent education than even to their natural good qualities. Now, as the figures of the Dioscuri, whether sculpted or painted, though resembling one another, still present such an amount of difference as appears when we contrast a boxer with a runner, so in these 2 youths, with all their resemblance in courage, temperance, generous temper, eloquence, and magnanimity, yet great contrasts also in their actions and polity blossomed forth, so to speak, and it displayed themselves, which I think it well to set forth. First, in the character and expression of his countenance, and in his movements, Tiberius was mild and sedate. Gaius was animated and impetuous. When Tiberius harangued the people, he would stand composedly on one spot, but Gaius was the first Roman who moved about on the rostra, and pulled his toga from his shoulder while he was speaking, as Cleon the Athenian is said to have been the first popular orator at Athens who threw his cloak from him and struck his thigh. The manner of Gaius was awe-striking and vehemently impassioned. The manner of Tiberius was more pleasing and calculated to stir the sympathies. The language of Tiberius was pure and elaborated to great nicety. That of Gaius was persuasive and exuberant. In like manner, in his mode of life and his table, Tiberius was frugal and simple. Compared with others, Gaius was moderate and austere, but contrasted with his brother, luxurious and curious, as we see by Drusus charging him with buying silver dolphins at the price of 1,250 drachma for every pound that they weighed. The differences in their character corresponded to their respective styles of speaking. Tiberius was moderate and mild. Gaius was rough and impetuous, and it often happened that in his harangues he was carried away by passion, contrary to his judgment, and his voice became shrill, and he fell to abuse, and grew confused in his discourse. To remedy this fault, he employed Licinius, a well-educated slave, who used to stand behind him when he was speaking with a musical instrument, such as is used as an accompaniment to singing, and whenever he observed that the voice of Gaius was becoming harsh and broken through passion, he would produce a soft note, upon which Gaius would immediately moderate his vehemence and his voice, and become calm. Such were the contrasts between the brothers, but in courage against the enemy, in justice to the subject nations, in vigilance in the discharge of public duties, and in self-control over indulgence, they were both alike. Tiberius was the elder by 9 years, a circumstance which caused their political career to be separated by an interval, and greatly contributed to the failure of their measures, for they did not rise to eminence at the same time, nor unite their strength in one effort, which, from their union, would have been powerful and irresistible. I must accordingly speak of each separately, and of the elder first. Immediately on attaining man's estate, Tiberius had so great a reputation that he was elected a member of the College of Augurs, rather for his excellent qualities than his noble birth. Appius Claudius, a man of consular and senatorial rank, who in consideration of his dignity was appointed princeps senatus, and in loftiness of character surpassed all his contemporaries, showed his opinion of Tiberius. For when the augurs were feasting together, Appius addressed Tiberius with many expressions of friendship, and solicited him to take his daughter to wife. Tiberius gladly accepted the proposal, and the agreement was forthwith made. As Appius was entering the door on his return home, he called out to his wife in a loud voice, "Anistia, I have given our daughter Claudia to wife." Anistia, in surprise, replied, "What is the need or the hurry, unless you have got Tiberius Gracchus for her husband?" I am aware that some writers tell this story of Tiberius the father of the Gracchi and of Scipio Africanus, but the majority have the story as I gave it, and Polybius says that after the death of Scipio Africanus, his kinsmen selected Tiberius to be the husband of Cornelia, and that she had neither been given in marriage nor betrothed by her father in his lifetime. Now, the younger Tiberius served in the army in Africa with the second Scipio, who had married his sister, and by living in the general's tent he soon learned his character, which exhibited many and great qualities for virtuous emulation and practical imitation. Tiberius also soon surpassed all the young soldiers in attention to discipline and in courage, and he was the first to mount the enemy's wall, as Fannius says, who also asserts that he mounted the wall with Tiberius, and shared the honor with him. While he was in the army, Tiberius won the affection of all the soldiers, and was regretted when he went away. After that expedition, he was elected quaestor, and it fell to his lot to serve in that capacity under the consul Gaius Mancinus, no bad man, but the most unlucky of Roman generals. Accordingly, in adverse fortune and critical affairs, the prudence and courage of Tiberius became the more conspicuous, and not only his prudence and courage, but what was truly admirable, his consideration and respect for his general, whose reverses almost made him forget who he was. Having been defeated in several great battles, Mancinus attempted to leave his camp by night and make a retreat. The Numantines, however, perceived his movements, and immediately seizing the camp, fell on the Romans in their flight and killed those in the rear, and at last, when they were surrounding the whole army and driving them to unfavorable ground, from which escape was impossible, Mancinus, despairing of all chance of saving himself by resistance, sent to treat for a truce in terms of peace. But the Numantines declared that they would trust nobody except Tiberius, and they bade Mancinus send him. The Numantines had come to this resolution as well from a knowledge of the young man's character, for there was much talk about him in this campaign, as from the remembrance of his father Tiberius, who after carrying on war against the Iberians and subduing many of them, made peace with the Numantines, and always kept the Roman people to a fair and just observance of it. Accordingly, Tiberius was sent, and had a conference with the Numantines, in which he got some favorable conditions, and by making some concessions, obtained a truce, and thus saved 20,000 Roman citizens, besides the slaves and camp followers. All the property that was taken in the camp became the booty of the Numantines, and among it were the tablets of Tiberius, which contained the entries and accounts of his administration as quaestor. Being very anxious to recover them, though the army had already advanced some distance, he returned to the city with 3 or 4 companions, and calling forth the magistrates of Numantia, he begged to have back his tablets, in order that his enemies might not have an opportunity of calumniating him if he should not be able to give an account of his administration of the public money. The Numantines were pleased at the opportunity of doing him a service, and invited him to enter the city, and when he stood hesitating, they came near, and clung to his hands, and were urgent in entreating him not to consider them as enemies any longer, but as friends, and to trust them. Tiberius determined to do so, as he was very anxious to get the tablets, and feared to irritate the Numantines if he should seem to distrust them. When he had entered the city, the first thing they did was to prepare an entertainment, and to urge him most importunately to sit down and eat with them. They afterwards gave him back the tablets, and bade him take anything else he liked. Tiberius, however, would have nothing except the frankincense which he wanted for the public sacrifices, and after a friendly embrace he took his leave of them. On his return from Rome, the whole transaction was greatly blamed as dishonorable and disgraceful to Rome. The kinsmen and friends of the soldiers, who were a large part of the people, crowded about Tiberius, charging the general with the disgraceful part of what had happened, and declaring that Tiberius had been the savior of so many citizens. Those who were the most vexed at the events in Iberia recommended that they should follow the example of their ancestors, for in former times the Romans stripped of their clothes and delivered up to the Samnites those who had purchased their safety on dishonorable terms, both the generals and all who had any share or participation in the treaty, quaestors and tribunes all alike, and on their heads they turned the violation of the oaths and infraction of the agreement. It was on this occasion particularly that the people showed their affection and zeal towards Tiberius, for they decided to deliver up the consul stripped and in chains to the Numantines, but they spared all the rest on account of Tiberius. It appears that Scipio also, who was then the most powerful man in Rome, gave his assistance in this matter, but nevertheless he was blamed for not saving Mancinus, and not making any exertion to ratify the treatment with the Numantines, which had been concluded by his relation and friend Tiberius. But whatever difference there was between Scipio and Tiberius on this occasion, perhaps originated mainly in jealousy, and was owing to the friends of Tiberius and the sophists, who endeavored to prejudice him against Scipio. There was, however, no irreconcilable breach between them, and no bad result from this affair. Indeed, it seems to me that Tiberius would never have been involved in those political measures which cost him his life, if Scipio Africanus had been at Rome while they were going on. But it was while Scipio was carrying on the war at Numantia that Tiberius commenced his legislation, to which he was led from the following motives. Whatever territory the Romans acquired from their neighbors in war, they sold part, and retaining the other part as public property, they gave it to the poorer citizens to cultivate, on the payment of a small sum to the treasury. But as the rich began to outbid the poor, and so to drive them out, a law was passed which forbade any one to have more than 500 jugera of land. This law restrained the greediness of the rich for a short time, and was a relief to the poor who remained on the land which they had hired, and cultivated the several portions which they originally had. But in the course of time their rich neighbors contrived to transfer the holdings to themselves in the names of other persons, and at last openly got possession of the greater part of the public lands in their own names. And the poor, being expelled, were not willing to take military service, and were careless about bringing up families, in consequence of which there was speedily a diminution in the number of freemen all through Italy, and the country was filled with ergastula of barbarian slaves, with whom the rich cultivated the lands from which they had expelled the citizens. Now Gaius Laelius, the friend of Scipio, attempted to remedy this mischief, but he desisted through fear of the disturbances that were threatened by the opposition of the rich, whence he got the name of wise or prudent, for such is the signification of the Roman word sapiens. Tiberius, on being elected tribune, immediately undertook the same measures, as most say, at the instigation of the orator Diophanes and the philosopher Blosius. Diophanes was an exile from Mytilene. Blosius was an Italian from Cumae, and had been an intimate at Rome with Antipater of Tarsus, who had done him the honor of dedicating to him some of his philosophical writings. Some give part of the blame to Cornelia also, the mother of Tiberius, who frequently reproached her sons that the Romans still called her the mother-in-law of Scipio, but not yet the mother of the Gracchi. Others say the jealousy of one Spurius Postumius, a contemporary of Tiberius, and a rival of his reputation as an orator, was the immediate motive. For it is said that when Tiberius returned to Rome from his military service, he found that Postumius had far outstripped him in reputation and influence, and seeing the distinction that Postumius had attained, he determined to get the advantage over him by engaging in measures which were attended with hazard, but promised great results. But his brother Gaius, in a certain book, has recorded that, as Tiberius was passing through Tyrrhenia on his road to Numantia, he observed the deserted state of the country, and that the cultivators and shepherds were foreign slaves and barbarians, and that he then for the first time conceived those political measures which to them were the beginning of infinite calamities. But the energy and ambition of Tiberius were mainly excited by the people, who urged him by riding on the porticos, the walls, and on the tombs to recover the public land for the poor. He did not, however, draw up the law without assistance, but took the advice of the citizens most eminent for character and reputation, among whom were Crassus, the Pontifex Maximus, Mucius Scaevola, the jurist, who was then consul, and Claudius Appius, his father-in-law. Never was a measure directed against such wrong and aggression conceived in more moderate and gentle terms. For though the rich well deserved to be punished for their violation of law, and to be compelled to surrender under penalties the land which they had been illegally enjoying, the law merely declared that they should give up their unjust acquisitions upon being paid the value of them, and should allow the lands to be occupied by the citizens who were in want of this relief. Though the reform of this abuse was so moderate and reasonable, the people were satisfied to take no notice of the past, and to secure themselves against wrong for the future. But the rich and those who had possessions detested the proposed law because of their greediness, and the proposer of it was the object of their indignation and jealousy. And accordingly they attempted to divert the people from the measure, by insinuating that Tiberius was proposing a division of land merely to disturb the state and to bring about a revolution. But they failed altogether, for Tiberius, supporting a measure in itself honorable and just, with an eloquence calculated to set off in even a meaner subject, showed his power and his superiority over his opponents, whenever the people were crowded round the rostra, and he addressed them about the poor. The wild beasts of Italy, he would say, had their dens and holes and hiding places, while the men who fought and died in defense of Italy enjoyed, indeed, the air and the light, but nothing else. Houseless, and without a spot of ground to rest upon, they wander about with their wives and children, while their commanders, with a lie in their mouth, exhort the soldiers in battle to defend their tombs and temples against the enemy. For out of so many Romans not one has a family altar or ancestral tomb, but they fight to maintain the luxury and wealth of others, and they die with the title of lords of the earth, without possessing a single clod of it to call their own. Such language as this, proceeding from a lofty spirit and genuine feeling, and delivered to the people who were vehemently excited and roused, none of the enemies of Tiberius attempted to refute. Abandoning, therefore, all idea of opposing him by words, they addressed themselves to Marcus Octavius, one of the tribunes, a young man of sober and orderly disposition, and a companion and friend of Tiberius. At first Octavius, from regard to Tiberius, evaded the proposals, but being urged and importuned by many of the powerful nobles, and, as it were, driven to it, he set himself in opposition to Tiberius, and prevented the passing of the law. Now all the power is virtually in the hands of the dissentient tribune, for the rest can do nothing if a single tribune opposes them. Irritated at this, Tiberius withdrew his moderate measure and introduced another, more agreeable to the people, and more severe against the illegal possessors of land. This new measure ejected persons out of the lands which they had got possession of contrary to existing laws. There was a daily contest between him and Octavius at the rostra, but though they opposed one another with great earnestness and rivalry, it is said that they never uttered a disparaging word against one another, and that no unbecoming expression ever escaped either of them against the other. It is not, then, in bacchanalian revelries only, as it seems, but also in ambitious rivalry and passion, that to be of noble nature and to have been well brought up restrains and governs the mind. Tiberius, observing that Octavius himself was obnoxious to the law and possessed a considerable tract of the public land, begged him to desist from his opposition, offering to pay him the value of the land out of his own purse, though he was by no means in affluent circumstances. Upon Octavius rejecting the proposal, Tiberius by an edict forbade all the other magistrates to transact any public business until the people had voted upon his law, and he placed his private seals on the temple of Saturn, that the quaestors would not be able to take anything out of it or pay anything in, and he gave public notice that a penalty would be imposed on the praetors if they disobeyed. In consequence of which all the magistrates were afraid and ceased from discharging their several functions. Upon this the possessors changed their dress and went about the forum in a piteous and humble guise, but in secret they plotted against Tiberius and endeavored to procure assassins to take him off. In consequence of which Tiberius, as everybody knew, wore under his dress a short sword, such as robbers use, which the Romans called dolo. When the day came and Tiberius was calling the people to vote, the voting urns were seized by the rich, and proceedings were put into great confusion. However, as the partisans of Tiberius, who had the superiority in numbers, were collecting in order to make resistance, Manlius and Fulvius, both consular men, falling down at the knees of Tiberius and clinging to his hands with tears, begged him to desist. Tiberius, seeing that matters were coming near to extremities, and from regard to the men also, asked them what they would have him do, to which they replied that they were not competent to advise on so important a matter, and they urged him to refer to the Senate, and at last he consented. The Senate met, but did nothing, owing to the opposition of the rich, who had great influence on the body, upon which Tiberius had recourse to the unconstitutional and violent measure of depriving Octavius of his office, finding it impossible to put his proposed law to the vote any other way. In the first place, he publicly entreated Octavius, addressing him affectionately and clinging to his hands, to yield to and gratify the people, who asked for nothing but their rights, and would only get a small matter in return for great dangers and sufferings. Octavius rejected his proposition, upon which Tiberius reminded him that both of them were magistrates, and were contending with equal power on a weighty matter, and that it was not possible for this struggle to continue without coming to open hostility. That he saw no remedy except for one of them to give up his office, and he bade Octavius put it to the people to vote on his case first, and that he would immediately descend to the station of a private man if the citizens should desire it. As Octavius refused this proposal also, Tiberius said that he would put the question about Octavius retiring from the tribunate to the people if Octavius did not change his resolution. Thus ended the assembly of that day. On the following day, Tiberius mounted the rostra, and again endeavored to persuade Octavius. But, as he would not yield, Tiberius proposed a law by which Octavius should be deprived of his tribunate, and he forthwith summoned the citizens to vote upon it. Now, there were 35 tribes, and when 17 of them had already given their vote, and the addition of one more tribe would reduce Octavius to a private condition, Tiberius stopped the voting, and again entreated Octavius, embracing him in the presence of the people, and urgently praying him not to be careless about being deprived of his office, and not to bring on him the blame of so severe and odious a measure. It is said that Octavius was not entirely untouched or unmoved by these entreaties, and his eyes were filled with tears, and he was silent for some time. But when he looked to the rich and the possessors, who were standing together in one body, through fear of losing their good opinion, as it seems, he boldly determined to run every risk, and told Tiberius to do what he pleased. Accordingly, the law was passed, and Tiberius ordered one of his freedmen to drag Octavius from the rostra, for Tiberius employed his own freedmen as officers, a circumstance which made the spectacle of Octavius dragged from the rostra with costume still more deplorable. At the same time, the people made an assault on Octavius, and though the rich all ran to his assistance and disengaged him from their hands, it was not without difficulty that he was rescued and made his escape from the mob. But one of his faithful slaves, who had placed himself in front of his master to defend him, had his eyes torn out. This violence was quite contrary to the wishes of Tiberius, who, on seeing what was going on, speedily made his way to the disturbance. The law about the land was now immediately carried, and triumviri were appointed for ascertaining its bounds and distributing it. The triumviri were Tiberius and his father-in-law, Claudius Appius, and Gaius Gracchus, his brother, who, however, was not at Rome, but serving under Scipio against Numantia. All this Tiberius accomplished quietly without any opposition, and he also procured to be elected tribune in the room of Octavius, not a person of rank, but one Mucius, a client of his own. The nobles, who were vexed at all these measures, and feared the growing power of Tiberius, treated him in the Senate with contumely, and upon his asking, according to custom, for a tent from the treasury for his use while he was distributing the land, they refused it to him, though others had often had one allowed them on less important occasions. and they only gave him for his expenses 9 oboli a day, which was done on the motion of Publius Nasica, who entered violently into the opposition against Tiberius, for he was in possession of a very large amount of public land, and was greatly annoyed at being forcibly ejected from it. But the people now became still more violent. A friend of Tiberius happened to die suddenly, and suspicious marks immediately showed themselves on the body. The people cried out that he was poisoned, and collecting in great numbers at the funeral, they carried the bier, and stood by it while the body was burnt. And the suspicion of poison appeared to have some reason, for the body burst on the pile, and sent forth such a quantity of corrupt humours as to quench the flame. And though a light was again applied, the body would not burn till it was removed to another place, where, after much trouble, the fire at last laid hold of it. Upon this Tiberius, with the view of exciting the people still more, changed his dress, and showing his children to the people, begged that they would protect them and their mother, for he now despaired of his own safety. On the death of Attalus Philometor, Eudemus of Pergamon brought his will to Rome, in which the Roman people were made the king's heir. In order to please the people, Tiberius promulgated a law to the effect that as soon as the king's treasures were received, they should be distributed among those who had assignments of land, in order to enable them to stock the farms and to assist them in their cultivation. With respect to the cities included within the kingdom of Attalus, he said that the Senate had no right to decide about them, but he would bring the subject before the popular assembly. This measure gave violent offense to the Senate, and Pompeius, getting up, said that he lived near Tiberius, and so knew that Eudemus of Pergamon had given a diadem out of the royal treasures and a purple robe to Tiberius, who designed to make himself king in Rome. Quintus Metellus reproached Tiberius by reminding him that whenever his father, during his censorship, was returning home from supper, the citizens used to put out the lights for fear it might be supposed that they were indulging too much in entertainments and drinking, but that the most insolent and needy of the citizens accompanied Tiberius with lights at night. Titus Annius, who was not a man of good repute or sober behavior, but in any contest of words by way of question and answer was considered to be unequaled, challenged Tiberius to answer definitely whether he had or had not branded with infamy his brother tribune, although by the law he was sacred and inviolable. As the question was received with signs of approbation, Tiberius, hastily quitting the Senate house, convoked the people and ordered Annius to be brought before him, with the intention of accusing him. But Annius, who was much inferior to Tiberius both in eloquence and reputation, had recourse to his tricks, and called on Tiberius to answer a few questions before he began his speech. Tiberius assented, and as soon as there was silence, Annius said, "If you intend to deprive me of my rank and disgrace me, and I appeal to one of your brother tribunes, and he shall come to my aid, and you shall then fall into a passion, will you deprive him of his office?" On this question being put, it is said that Tiberius, though no man was readier in words or bolder in action, was so confused that he made no reply. For the present, Tiberius dissolved the assembly, seeing that his proceedings with respect to Octavius were not liked either by the nobles or the people, for they considered that the high and honorable dignity of the tribunate, which had been kept unimpaired up to that time, had been destroyed and trampled upon. He made a harangue to the people, a few of the arguments of which it will not be out of place to mention, for the purpose of showing the persuasive eloquence and the subtlety of the man. He said that a tribune was sacred and inviolable, only because he was dedicated to the people and was the guardian of the people. If, then, a tribune should deviate from his duty and wrong the people, abridge their power and deprive them of the opportunity of voting, he had by his own act deprived himself of his rank, by not fulfilling the conditions on which he received it. Now he must consider a tribune to be still a tribune, though he should dig down the Capitol and burn the naval arsenal. If he should commit such excesses as these, he is a bad tribune, but if he should attempt to deprive the people of their power, he is not a tribune at all. And is it not a monstrous thing if a tribune shall have power to order a consul to be put in prison, and the people shall not be able to deprive a tribune of his power when he is using it against the people who gave it to him? For both tribune and consul are equally chosen by the people. Now the kingly office, beside comprehending within it all civil power, is consecrated to the divinity by the discharge of the chief ceremonials of religion. and yet the state ejected Tarquinius for his wrongdoing, and for the violence of one man the ancient power which established Rome was overthrown. And what is there at Rome so sacred, so venerated as the virgins who guard the ever-burning fire? But if any of them offends, she is buried alive. For when they sin against the gods, they no longer retain that inviolable sanctity which they have by being devoted to the gods. In like manner, neither a tribune, when he is wronging the people, any right to retain the inviolable character which he receives from the people, for he is destroying the very power which is the origin of his own power. And indeed, if he has legally received the tribunician power by the votes of a majority of the tribes, how is it that he cannot even still more legally be deposed by the vote of all the tribes? Now, nothing is so sacred and inviolable as things dedicated to the gods. But yet no one has ever hindered the people from using such things, moving them and changing their places as they please. It is therefore legal for the people to transfer the tribunate, as a consecrated thing, from one man to another, and that the tribunate is not an inviolable thing, nor an office of which a man cannot be divested, is clear from this that many magistrates have abdicated their office and prayed to be excused from it of their own free will. Such were the heads of the justification of Tiberius. His friends, seeing the threats of his enemies and their combination, thought that he ought to be a candidate for the tribunate for the next year, and Tiberius attempted to strengthen his popularity by promising to carry new measures, such as a diminution of the period of military service, an appeal to the people from the judices, an intermixture of an equal number of the equites with the senators, from whom alone the judices were then taken, and in every way he attempted to abridge the power of the Senate, influenced rather by passion and ambition than justice in the interests of the state. While the voting was going on, the friends of Tiberius, seeing that their enemies were gaining the advantage, for all the people were not present, at first attempted to prolong the time by abusing the other tribunes, and next they dissolved the meeting and appointed it for the following day. Tiberius, going down to the forum, supplicated the citizens in humble manner, and with tears in his eyes. He then said that he feared his enemies, and would break into his house by night and kill him, and thus he induced a great number of the citizens to take their station about his house, and watch there all night.
At daybreak the man came to bring the birds which the Romans use in their auspices, and he threw them food. But the birds would not come out of the basket, with the exception of one, though the man shook it hard. And even though this one would not touch the food, but after raising its left wing and stretching out a leg it ran back to the basket. This reminded Tiberius of another omen that had happened. He had a helmet which he wore into battle, and elaborately worked and splendid. Some snakes had got into the helmet unobserved, and laid their eggs and hatched them there. This made Tiberius still more uneasy about the signs from the fowls. Nevertheless, he advanced up the city on hearing that the people was assembled about the Capitol. But before he got out of the house he stumbled over the threshold, and the blow was so far violent that the nail of his great toe was broken, and the blood ran out through his shoe. He had not got far before some crows were seen fighting on the roof of a house on the left hand, and though a great crowd was passing by, as was natural on such an occasion, a stone which was pushed off by one of the crows fell by the feet of Tiberius. This made even the boldest of his adherents hesitate, but Blosius of Cumae, who was present, said it would be a great shame and a great disgrace if Tiberius, a son of Gracchus and a grandson of Scipio Africanus, and a defender of the Roman people, should not obey the summons of the people for fear of a crow, and that his enemies would not treat this cowardly act as a matter of ridicule, but would make it the ground of calumniating him to the people, as playing the tyrant, and treating them with contempt. At the same time, many persons ran up to Tiberius with a message from his friends in the capital to hasten there, as all was going on favorably. And indeed, everything promised well at first, for as soon as he appeared he was greeted with friendly cheers, and as he ascended the Capitol he was joyfully received, and the people crowded about him to prevent any stranger from approaching. Now Mucius began to summon the tribes again, but nothing could be conducted with the usual forms on account of the confusion that prevailed among those who were on the outskirts of the assembly, where they were struggling with their opponents, who were attempting to force their way in and mingle with the rest. At this juncture Flavius Flaccus, a senator, posted himself in a conspicuous place, and as it was not possible to make his voice heard so far, he made a signal with his hand that he wished to say something in private to Tiberius. Tiberius bade the crowd let Flaccus pass, who was with great difficulty making his way up to Tiberius, told him that the Senate was sitting, that as they could not prevail on the consul, the rich were resolving to kill Tiberius themselves, and that they had armed many of their slaves and friends for this purpose. Upon Tiberius reporting this to those who were standing about him, they forthwith tucked up their dress, and breaking the staves which the officers used to keep the crowd back, distributed the fragments among them, and made ready to defend themselves against their assailants. While those at a distance were wondering at what was going on, and asking what it meant, Tiberius touched his head with his hand, since his voice could not be heard, intending thereby to signify to the people that his life was in danger. His enemies, on seeing this, ran to the Senate, and told them that Tiberius was asking for a crown, and that his touching his head was a proof of it. On this the whole body was greatly disturbed, Nasica entreating the consul to protect the state and put down the tyrant. The consul, however, answered mildly that he would not be the first to use violence, and that he would not take any citizen's life without a regular trial. If, however, he said, the people should come to an illegal vote at the instigation of Tiberius, or from expulsion, or from compulsion, he would not respect any such decision. Upon this, Nasica, springing up, exclaimed, "Well then, as the consul betrays the state, do you who wish to maintain the laws follow me?" As he uttered these words, he drew a skirt of his dress over his head, and hastened to the Capitol, and the senators who followed him, wrapping their dress about them with one hand, pushed all the people they met out of the way, no one opposing them, from respect to their rank, but taking to flight, and trampling down one another. The followers of the senators had clubs and sticks which they had brought from home, but the senators, seizing the fragments and legs of the benches, which were broken by the people in their hurry to escape, made right to Tiberius, and struck all those who were in their road. The people were all put to flight or killed. As Tiberius was attempting to make his escape, someone laid hold of his dress, on which he dropped his toga and fled in his tunic, but he stumbled over some persons who were lying on the ground, and was thrown down. While he was endeavoring to rise, he received the first blow, as it is universally admitted, from Publius Satirius, one of his colleagues, who struck him on the head with the leg of a bench. Lucius Rufus claimed the credit of giving him the second blow, as if that were a thing to be proud of. Above 300 persons lost their lives by sticks and stones, but none by the sword. This is said to have been the first disturbance at Rome since the abolition of the kingly power, which ended in bloodshed and the death of citizens. All previous disputes, though they were neither trifling nor about trifling matters, were settled by mutual concession. The nobles yielded through fear of the people, and the people yielded from respect to the Senate. Even on this occasion, it is probable that Tiberius would have given way to persuasion without any difficulty, and still more readily if his assailants had not come to bloodshed and blows, for those about him were not above 3,000 in number. But the combination against him seems to have proceeded rather from the passion and hatred of the rich citizens than from the reasons which they had alleged, and the brutal and indecent treatment of his dead body is a proof of this, for they would not listen to his brother's request to take up the body and bury it at night, but it was thrown into the Tiber with the other bodies. And this was not all. They banished some of his friends without trial, and others they seized and put to death, among whom was Diophanes the orator. One Caius Villius they shut up in a vessel with snakes and vipers, and thus he died. Blosius of Cumae, being brought before the consuls and questioned about what had passed, admitted that he had done everything at the bidding of Tiberius. On Nasica asking him, "What if Tiberius had told you to burn the Capitol?" Blosius said that Tiberius would never have given him any such order. The same question being often put to him, and by several persons, he said, "If he had commanded me to burn the Capitol, it would have been a good deed for me to do, for Tiberius would not have given such an order unless it was for the interest of the people." Blosius, however, was set at liberty, and afterwards went to Aristarchus in Asia, on the ruin of whose affairs he killed himself. The Senate, under present circumstances, endeavored to soothe the people. They made no opposition to the distribution of the public land, and they allowed the people to elect another commissioner in place of Tiberius. Having come to a vote, they elected Publius Crassus, a relation of Gracchus, for his daughter Licenia was the wife of Gaius Gracchus. Cornelius Nepos, indeed, says that Gaius did not marry the daughter of Crassus, but the daughter of Brutus, who triumphed over the Lusitanians. However, the majority of writers state the matter as I have done. Now, as the people were sore about the death of Tiberius, and were manifestly waiting for an opportunity to be revenged, and Nasica was threatened with prosecutions, the Senate, fearing for his safety, made a decree for sending him to Asia, though they had nothing for him to do there. For when men met Nasica, they did not conceal their hostility, but broke out into violence, and abused him wherever they fell in with him, calling him accursed and a tyrant, who had stained with the blood of an inviolable and sacred functionary the most sacred and revered of all the holy places in the city. Accordingly, Nasica left Italy, though bound by the most sacred functions, for he was Pontifex Maximus, and rambling about despised from place to place, he died no long time after in the neighborhood of Pergamum. It is no wonder if Nasica was so much hated by the people, when even Scipio Africanus, whom the Romans considered inferior to no man in integrity, and loved as well as any, narrowly escaped losing the popular favor, because, on receiving the news of the death of Tiberius, at Numantia, he exclaimed in the verse of Homer, "So perish all who do the like again." Consequently, when Gaius and Fulvius asked him, before an assembly of the people, what he thought of the death of Tiberius, he showed by his answer that he was not pleased with the measures of Tiberius. This made the people interrupt him with their shouts when he was speaking, as they had never done before, and Scipio was so far transported with passion as to break out into invectives against them. But of this I have spoken more particularly in the life of Scipio. Gaius Gracchus at first, either through fear of his enemies, or with the view of making them odious, withdrew from the forum, and kept quiet at home, like a man humbled for the present, and intending for the future to keep aloof from public affairs, which gave occasion for some people to say that he disliked the measures of Tiberius, and had abandoned them. He was also still quite a youth, for he was 9 years younger than his brother, and Tiberius was not 30 when he was killed. But in the course of time, as his character gradually displayed itself in his aversion to indolence, luxury, wine, and all matters of private profit, and it was clear from his application to the study of eloquence that he was preparing, as it were, his pinions for public life, and that he would not remain quiet. And further, when he showed by his defense of Vettius, one of his friends, who was under prosecution, the people all around him being wild and frantic with delight, that the rest of the orators were mere children, the nobles were again alarmed, and there was much talk among them that they would not allow Caius to obtain the tribunate. It happened without any set designs that the lot fell on them to go as quaestor to Sardinia under Orestes, the consul, which pleased his enemies, and was not disagreeable to Gaius. For he was fond of war, and equally disciplined for military service, and speaking in the courts of justice. But he still shrunk from public affairs, and the rostra, as he would not resist the invitations of the people and his friends. He was well pleased with this opportunity of leaving Rome. It is true, it is a common opinion, that Gaius was a pure demagogue, and much more greedy of popular favor than Tiberius. But it was not so in fact, and Gaius seems to have been involved in public affairs rather through a kind of necessity than choice. Cicero, the orator, also says that Gaius declined all offices, and had determined to live in retirement, that his brother appeared to him in a dream, and said, "Gaius, why do you linger? There is no escape. One life for both of us, and one death in defense of the people, is our fate." Now Gaius, during his stay in Sardinia, exhibited his excellent qualities in every way. He far surpassed all the young men in military courage, in upright conduct to the subject people, in loyalty and respect to the commander, and in temperance, frugality, and attention to his duties he excelled even his elders. The winter having been severe and unhealthy in Sardinia, the general demanded clothing for his soldiers from the cities, upon which they sent to Rome to pray to be relieved from this imposition. The Senate granted their petition, and ordered the general to get supplies for the troops by other means. But, as the general was unable to do this, and the soldiers were suffering, Gaius went round to the cities, and induced them voluntarily to send clothing and to assist the Romans. This being reported to Rome, made the Senate uneasy, for they viewed it as a preliminary to popular agitation. Ambassadors also arrived at Rome from Libya, with a message from King Micipsa that the king had sent corn to the commander in Sardinia out of respect for Gaius Gracchus. The Senate, taking offense at the message, would not receive the ambassadors, and they passed a decree that fresh troops should be sent out to replace those in Sardinia, but that Orestes should stay, intending by this measure to keep Gaius there also, in respect of his office. On this being done, Gaius immediately set sail in a passion, and appearing at Rome, contrary to all expectation, was not only blamed by his enemies, but even the people considered it a strange thing for a quaestor to leave his general behind. However, when the matter was brought before the censors, he asked for permission to make his defense, and he produced such a change in opinion of his audience that he was acquitted, and considered to have been exceedingly ill used. He said that he had served in the army for 12 years, while others were only required to serve 10 years, and that he had exercised the functions of quaestor to the commander for 3 years, though the law allowed him to return after 1 year's service. He added that he was the only soldier who took out a full purse with him and brought it back empty, while the rest took out with them only jars of wine, which they had emptied in Sardinia, and brought them back full of gold and silver. After this, his enemies brought fresh charges against him, and harassed him with the prosecutions on the ground of causing the defection of the allies, and having participated in the conspiracy which had been detected at Fregellae. But he cleared himself of all suspicion, and having established his innocence, immediately set about canvassing for the tribunate. All the men of distinction, without exception, opposed him, and so great a multitude flocked to Rome from all parts of Italy, to the Comitia, that many of them could not find lodgings, and the Camp Martius being unable to contain the numbers, they shouted from the housetops and tilings. However, the nobility so far prevailed against the people as to disappoint the hopes of Gaius, inasmuch as he was not returned first, as he expected, but only fourth. But upon entering on his office he soon made himself first, for he surpassed every Roman in eloquence, and his misfortunes gave him a license for speaking freely when lamenting the fate of his brother. He took every opportunity of directing the thoughts of the people to this subject, reminding them of former times, and contrasting the conduct of their ancestors, who went to war with the Falisci on behalf of Gemicus, a tribune, who had been insulted by him, and condemned Caius Veturius to death, because he was the only man that did not make way for a tribune as he was passing through the forum. "But before your eyes," he exclaimed, "these men beat Tiberius to death with staves, and his body was dragged through the midst of the city to be thrown into the Tiber, and all his friends who were caught were put to death without trial. And yet it is an old usage among us, if a man is accused of a capital charge and does not appear, for a trumpeter to come to the house of his door of his house in the morning, and summon him by the sound of the trumpet. And the judices cannot vote upon the charge till this has been done. So circumspect and careful were the Romans of old in the trials of persons accused." Having first stirred up the people by such harangues as these, and he had a very loud voice, and was most vigorous in speech, he promulgated 2 laws, one to the effect that if the people had deprived any magistrate of his office, he should be incapacitated from holding office a second time, and the other which rendered a magistrate liable to a public prosecution if he had banished any citizen without trial. One of these rogations made the direct effect of branding with infamy Marcus Octavius, who had been deprived of the tribunate by Tiberius, and Popilius came within the penalties of the other, for during his praetorship he had banished the friends of Tiberius. Popilius did not stand this trial, and he fled from Italy. But the other law Gaius himself withdrew, saying that he refrained from touching Octavius at the request of his mother Cornelia. The people admired his conduct on this occasion, and they gave their consent, for they respected Cornelia no less for the sake of her sons than her father, and afterwards they set up a bronze statue of her with the inscription, "Cornelia, Mother of the Gracchi." There are recorded several things that Gaius said in defense of his mother in a rhetorical and coarse way, in reply to one of his enemies. "What," said he, "do you abuse Cornelia, the mother of Tiberius?" And the man labored under the imputation of being a dissolute fellow. He added, "How can you have the impudence to compare yourself with Cornelia? Have you been a mother, as she has?" And more to the like effect, but still coarser. Such was the bitterness of his language, and many like things occur in his writings. Of the laws which he promulgated with the view of gaining the popular favor and weakening the Senate, One was for the establishment of colonies and the distribution of public land among the poor. Another provided for supplying the soldiers with clothing at the public expense, without any deduction on this account being made from their pay, and exempted youths under 17 years of age from being drafted for the army. A third was in favor of the allies, and put the Italians on the same footing as the citizens with respect to the suffrage. Another related to grain, and had for its object the lowering of the price for the poor. The last related to the judices, a measure which most of all encroached on the privileges of the Senate, for the Senate alone supplied judices for the trials, and this privilege rendered that body formidable both to the people and the equites. The law of Gracchus added 300 equites to the Senate, who were also 300 in number, and it made the judices eligible out of the whole 600. In his endeavors to carry this law, he is said to have made every exertion, and in particular it was recorded that all the popular leaders who preceded him turned their faces to the Senate and the Comitium while they were speaking, but he was the first who turned his face the other way, to the Forum, while haranguing the people, and he continued to do so. And by a small deviation and alteration in attitude, he stirred a great question, and in a manner transformed the government from an aristocratical to a democratical form, by this new attitude intimating that the orators should direct their speeches to the many, and not to the Senate. The people not only passed this law, but empowered Gracchus to select from the equites those who were to act as judices, which conferred on him a kind of monarchical authority, and even the Senate now assented to the measures which he proposed in their body. But all the measures which he proposed were honorable to the Senate. Such, for instance, was the very equitable and just decree about the grain which Fabius, the propraetor, sent from Iberia. Gracchus induced the Senate to sell the grain and return the money which it produced to the Iberian cities, and further to censure Fabius for making the Roman dominion heavy and intolerable to the subject nations. This measure brought him great reputation and popularity in the provinces. He also introduced measures for sending out colonies, the construction of roads, and the building of public granaries, and he made himself director and superintendent for the carrying all these measures into effect. Though engaged in so many great undertakings, he was never wearied, but with wonderful activity and labor he effected every single object as if he had for the time no other occupation, so that even those who thoroughly hated and feared him were struck with amazement at the rapidity and perfect execution of all that he undertook. But the people looked with admiration on the man himself, seeing him attended by crowds of building contractors, artificers, ambassadors, magistrates, soldiers, and learned men, to all of whom he was easy of access. And while he maintained his dignity, he was affable to all, and adapted his behavior to the condition of every individual, and so proved the falsehood of those who called him tyrannical, or arrogant, or violent. He thus showed himself more skilful as a popular leader in his dealings with men, and in his conduct than in his harangues from the rostra. But Gaius busied himself most with the construction of roads, having in view utility, convenience, and ornament. The roads were made in a straight line, right through the country, partly of quarried stone, and partly with tight rammed masses of earth. By filling up the depressions and throwing bridges across those parts which were traversed by winter torrents or deep ravines, and raising the roads on both sides to the same uniform height, the whole line was made level, and presented an agreeable appearance. He also measured all the roads by miles (the Roman mile is not quite 8 Greek stadia), and fixed stone blocks to mark the distances. He placed other stones at less distances from one another on each side of the road, that persons might thus easily mount their horses without assistance. As the people extolled him for all these services, and were ready to show their good will towards him in any way, he said on one occasion when he was addressing them, that he would ask a favor, which he would value above everything if it was granted, but if it were refused he should not complain. It was accordingly expected that he would ask for the consulship, and everybody supposed that he would be a candidate for the consulship and the tribunate at the same time. When the consular comitia were near, and all were at the highest point of expectation, Gaius appeared conducting Gaius Fannius into the Campus Martius, and canvassing with his friends for Fannius. This gave Fannius a great advantage. Fannius was elected consul, and Gaius tribune for the second time, though he was neither a candidate nor canvassed, but his election was entirely due to the zeal of the people. Perceiving, however, that the Senate was clearly opposed to him, and that the kind feeling of Fannius towards him cooled, he forthwith endeavored to attach the people by other measures, by proposing to send colonies to Tarentum and Capua, and by inviting the Latins to a participation in the Roman franchise. The Senate, fearing that Gracchus would become irresistible, attempted a new and unusual method of diverting the people from him, by opposing popular measures to his, and by gratifying the people, contrary to sound policy. Livius Drusus was one of the colleagues of Gaius, a man by birth and education inferior to none in Rome, and in character, eloquence, and wealth equal to any who enjoyed either honor or power by the aid of these advantages. To him accordingly the chief nobles applied, and they urged him to attack Gaius, and to unite with him against them, not by adopting violent measures, nor coming into collision with the many, but by a course of administration adapted to please, and by making such concessions as it would have been honorable to refuse, even at the risk of unpopularity. Livius, having agreed to employ his tribunician authority on the side of the Senate, framed measures which had neither any honorable nor any useful objective. He only had in view to outbid Gaius in the popular favor, just as it is in a comedy, by making himself busy and vying with his rival. This showed most clearly that the Senate were not displeased with the measures of Gaius, but only wished to destroy him or completely humble him. When Gaius proposed to send out 10 colonies consisting of citizens of the best character, the Senate accused him of truckling to the people. But they cooperated with Livius, who proposed 12 colonies, each of which was to consist of 3,000 needy citizens. They set themselves in opposition to Gaius when he proposed to distribute land among the poor, subject to a yearly payment to the treasury from each, on the ground that he was trying to gain the popular favor. But they were satisfied when Livius proposed to relieve the colonists even from this payment. Further, Gaius gave them offense by proposing to confer on the Latins the Roman suffrage. But when Livius brought forward a measure which forbade any Latin to be beaten with rods while serving in the army, they supported it. And indeed, Livius himself, in his harangues to the people, always said that he only proposed what was agreeable to the Senate, who had a regard for the many, which indeed was the only good that resulted from his measures. For the people became more pacifically disposed towards the Senate, and though the most distinguished of them were formerly suspected and hated by the people, Livius himself did away with and softened their recollection of past grievances and their ill-feeling, by giving out that it was in accordance with the wish of the Senate that he had entered upon his popular career and framed measures to please the many. But the best proof to the people of the good intentions and honesty of Livius was, that he proposed nothing for himself or in behalf of his own interests, for he appointed other persons to superintend the establishment of the colonies, and he did not meddle with the administration of the money, while Gaius had assigned to himself most of such functions, and the most important of them. It happened that Rubrius, one of the tribunes, had proposed a measure for the colonization of Carthage, which had been destroyed by Scipio, and as the lot fell on Gaius, he set sail to Libya to found the colony. In his absence, Drusus, making still further advances, insinuated himself into the favor of the people, and gained them over mainly by calumniating Fulvius. But this Fulvius was a friend of Gaius and a joint commissioner for the distribution of lands, but he was a noisy fellow, and especially disliked by the Senate. He was also suspected by others of stirring up the allies and secretly encouraging the Italians to revolt, and though this was said without proof or inquiry, Fulvius himself gave it credit by his unwise and revolutionary policy. This more than anything else destroyed the popularity of Gaius, who came in for his share of the odium against Fulvius, and when Scipio Africanus died without any obvious cause, and certain signs of blows and violence were supposed to be visible on the body, as I told in the life of Scipio, the suspicion fell chiefly on Fulvius, who was his enemy, and on that day had abused Scipio from the rostra. Suspicion attached to Gaius also. So abominable a crime committed against the first and greatest of the Romans went unpunished, and there was not even an inquiry, for the many opposed it and stopped the investigation through fear for Gaius, lest he should be discovered to be implicated in the murder. These events indeed belong to an earlier period. In Libya, as to the foundation of Carthage, which Gaius named Junonia, which is the same as Herrea, It is said that there were many supernatural hindrances. For the first standard was seized and broken by a violent gust of wind, though the standard-bearer stuck to it vigorously, and the victims which were lying on the altar were dispersed by a tempest, and carried beyond the stakes which marked the limits of the city, and the stakes were torn up by the wolves, and carried a long way off. However, Gaius, after settling and arranging everything in 70 days, returned to Rome upon hearing that Fulvius was hard pressed by Drusus, and that affairs required his presence. Lucius Opimius, a man who belonged to the faction of the oligarchs, and had great influence in the Senate, failed on a former occasion when he was a candidate for the consulship, at the time when Gaius brought forward Fannius and canvassed against Opimius. But now, being supported by a powerful party, it was expected that Opimius would be elected consul, and would put down Gaius, whose influence was already in some degree on the wane, and the people also were tired of such measures as this, for there were many who sought their favor, and the Senate easily gave way. On his return from Libya, Gaius removed from the Palatium to the neighborhood of the Forum, as being a more popular place of residence, for it happened that most of the lower classes of the poor lived there. He next promulgated the rest of his measures, intending to take the vote of the people upon them. As crowds were collecting from all parts to support Gaius, the Senate prevailed on the consul Fannius to drive out of the city all who were not Romans. Accordingly, a strange and unusual proclamation was made, to the effect that none of the allies or friends of the Roman state should appear in Rome during those days, on which Gaius published a counter-edict, in which he criminated the consul and promised his support to the allies if they remained in Rome. But he did not keep his promise, for though he saw one of them, who was his own friend and intimate, he dragged off by the officers of Fannius, he passed by without helping him, whether it was that he feared to put to the test his power, which was now on the decline, or that he did not choose, as he said, to give his enemies the opportunity which they were seeking of coming to a collision and a struggle. It also happened that he had incurred the ill will of his fellow colleagues in the following manner. The people were going to see an exhibition of gladiators in the Forum, and most of the magistrates had constructed seats around the place with the intention of letting them for hire. But Gaius urged them to remove the seats, that the poor might be able to see the show without paying. As no one took any notice of what he said, he waited till the night before the show, when he went with the workmen whom he had under him, and removed the seats, and at daybreak he pointed out to the people that the place was clear, for which the many considered him a man, but he offended his colleagues, who viewed him as an audacious and violent person. Owing to this circumstance, it is supposed, he lost his third tribunate, though he had most votes, for it is said that his colleagues acted illegally and fraudulently in the proclamation and return. This, however, was disputed. Gaius did not bear his failure well, and to his enemies who were exulting over him, he is said to have observed, with more arrogance than was befitting, that their laugh was a sardonic laugh, for they knew not what a darkness his political measures had spread all around them. After effecting the election of Opimius to the consulship, the enemies of Gaius began to repeal many of his laws, and to disturb the settlement of Carthage, for the purpose of irritating Gaius, in order that he might give them some cause of quarrel, and so be got rid of. He endured this for some time, but his friends, and especially Fulvius, began to urge him on. He again attempted to combine his partisans against the consul. On this occasion it is said that his mother also helped him, by hiring men from remote parts and sending them to Rome in the disguise of reapers, for it is supposed that these matters are obscurely alluded to in her letters to her son. Others, on the contrary, say that this was done quite contrary to the wishes of Cornelia. On the day on which the parties of Opimius intended to repeal the laws of Gaius, the capital had been occupied by the opposite faction early in the morning. The consul had offered the sacrifices, and one of his officers, named Quintus Centilius, was carrying the viscera to another part, when he is said to the partisans of Fulvius, "Make way for honest men, you rascals." Some say that as he uttered these words, he also held out his bare arm with insulting gestures. However this may be, Ontilius was killed on the spot, being pierced with large styles, said to have been made expressly for the purpose. The people were greatly disturbed at the murder, but it produced exactly opposite effects on the leaders of the two parties. Gaius was deeply grieved at what had happened, and abused his party for having given a handle to their enemies, who had long been looking for it. But Opimius, as if he had got the opportunity, which he wanted, was highly elated and urged the people to avenge the murder. A torrent of rain happened to fall just then, and the meeting was dissolved. Early on the following day, Opimius summoned the Senate to transact business. In the meantime, the naked body of Antilius was placed on a bier, and according to arrangement, carried through the forum past the Senate house with loud cries and lamentations. Opimius, though he knew what was going on, pretended to be surprised at the noise, and the senators went out to see what was the matter. When the bier had been set down in the midst of the crowd, the senators began to express their indignation at so horrible and monstrous a crime. But this only moved the people to hate and execrate the oligarchs, who, murdering Tiberius Gracchus in the Capitol, a tribune, had treated his body with insult, while Antilius, a mere servant, who perhaps had not deserved his fate, yet was mainly to blame for what had happened, was laid out in the forum, and surrounded by the Roman Senate lamenting and assisting at the funeral of a hireling. And all this merely to accomplish the ruin of the only remaining guardian of the people's liberties. On returning to the Senate house, the senators passed a decree by which the consul Opimius was directed to save the state in such way as he could, and to put down the tyrants. Opimius gave notice to the senators to arm, and each eques was commanded to bring in the morning 2 armed slaves. On the other side, Fulvius also made preparation and got together a rabble, but Gaius, as he left the forum, stood opposite his father's statue, and looking at it for some time without speaking, at last burst into tears, and, fetching a deep sigh, walked away. The sight of this moved many of the spectators to compassion, and blaming themselves for deserting the man and betraying him, they came to the house of Gaius, and passed the night at his door, but not in the same manner as those who watched about the house of Fulvius, for they spent the night in tumult and shouting, drinking and bragging what they would do. Fulvius himself, who was the first to get drunk, spoke and acted in a way quite unseemly for a man of his age. The followers of Gaius, viewing the state of affairs as a public calamity, kept quiet, thinking of the future. They passed the night watching and sleeping in turns. At daybreak, Fulvius was with difficulty roused from his drunken sleep, and his partisans, arming themselves with the warlike spoils in his house, which he had taken in his victory over the Gauls during his consulship, with loud threats and shouts went to seize the Aventine hill. Gaius would not arm, but went out in his toga, just as if he was proceeding to the forum, with only a short dagger at his side. As he was going out the door, his wife met him, and throwing one arm around him, while she held in the other their little child, said, "Gaius, not as in time past do I take my leave of you going to the rostra as tribune and as legislator, nor yet going to a glorious war, where, if you died in the service of your country, you would still leave me an honored grief, but you are going to expose yourself to the murderers of Tiberius. 'Tis right indeed to go unarmed, and to suffer rather than do wrong, but you will perish without benefiting the state. The worst has now prevailed. Force and the sword determine all controversies. If your brother had died at Numantia, his body would have been restored to us on the usual terms of war. But now, perchance, I too shall have to supplicate some river or the sea to render up to me your corpse from its keeping. What faith can we put in the laws or in the deities since the murder of Tiberius?" While Licinius was thus giving vent to sorrow, Gracchus gently freed himself from his wife's embrace, and went off in silence with his friends. Licinius, as she attempted to lay hold of his dress, fell down on the floor, and lay there some time speechless, until her slaves took her up fainting, and carried her to her brother Crassus. While they were all assembled, Fulvius, at the request of Gaius, sent his younger son with a caduceus to the forum. He was a most beautiful youth, and with great decorum and modesty, and with tears in his eyes, he addressed to the consul and the Senate the message of conciliation. The majority who were present were not disinclined to come to terms, but Opimius replied that Fulvius and Gracchus must not attempt to bring the Senate to an accommodation through the medium of a messenger. They must consider themselves as citizens who had to account for their conduct, and come down and surrender, and then beg for mercy. He further told the youth that these were the terms on which he must come a second time, or not at all. Now Gaius, it is said, wished to go and clear himself before the Senate, but as no one else assented, Fulvius again sent his son to address the Senate on their behalf in the same terms as before. But Opimius, who was eager to come to blows, forthwith ordered the youth to be seized and put in prison, and advanced against the party of Fulvius with many legionary soldiers and Cretan bowmen, who mainly contributed to put them into confusion by discharging their arrows and wounding them. The partisans of Fulvius being put to flight, he made his escape into a bath that was not used, where he was soon discovered and put to death with his elder son. Gaius was not observed to take any part in the contest, but greatly troubled at what was taking place, he retired to the temple of Diana, and was going to kill himself there, but was prevented by his faithful friends Pomponius and Licinius, who took the sword away and induced him to fly. It is said that he went down on his knees in the temple, and stretching out his hands to the statue of the goddess, prayed that the Roman people, for their ingratitude and treachery to him, might always be slaves, for the greater part of them had openly gone over to the other side upon an amnesty being proclaimed. In his flight, Gaius was followed by his enemies, who were near overtaking him at the wooden bridge, but his two friends, bidding him make his escape, opposed the pursuers and allowed no man to pass the head of the bridge till they were killed. Gaius was accompanied by a single slave, named Philocrates, and though all the spectators urged him to fly, just as if they were shouting at a race, yet no one, though he prayed for it, would come to his aid, or lend him a horse, for the pursuers were close upon him. He just escaped into a sacred grove of the Furies, and there he fell by the hands of Philocrates, who killed himself on the body of his master. Some say both of them were taken alive by their enemies, and that the slave embraced his master so closely that Gaius could not be struck until the slave had been dispatched first, and with many blows. It is said that a man cut off the head of Gaius and was carrying it away, but it was taken from him by a friend of Opimius named Septimius, for a proclamation had been made at the beginning of the contest that those who brought the heads of Gaius and Fulvius should have their weight in gold. The head of Gaius was brought to Opimius by Septimius, struck on a spear, and it weighed 17 pounds and 2/3 in the scales. Septimius was a scoundrel and a knave here also, for he had taken out the brain and dropped melted lead in its place. Those who brought the head of Fulvius got nothing, for they belonged to the lower class. The bodies of Gaius and Fulvius and their partisans were thrown into the river, the number of dead being 3,000. Their property was sold, and the produce paid into the treasury. They also forbade the women to lament for their relatives, and Licenia was deprived of her marriage portion. But their conduct was most cruel to the younger son of Fulvius, who had neither raised up his hand against them, nor been among the combatants, for he was seized before the battle, when he came to treat of terms, and was put to death after the battle. But what most of all vexed the people was the circumstance of Opimius erecting a temple to Concord, which was viewed as an evidence of his insolence and arrogance, and as a kind of triumph for the slaughter of so many citizens. Accordingly, by night, some person wrote under the inscription on the temple the following line: "The work of discord makes the temple of concord." This Opimius, the first man that ever exercised the dictatorial power in the office of consul, and who had condemned without trial 3,000 citizens, and among them Gaius Gracchus and Fulvius Flaccus. Flaccus, a consular, who had enjoyed a triumph. Gracchus, the first man of his age in character and reputation. This Opimius did not keep himself free from corruption. Being sent as a commissioner to Jugurtha, the Numidian, he was bribed by him, and being convicted of most shameful corruption, he spent the last years of his life in infamy, hated and insulted by the people, who, though humbled and depressed for the time, soon showed how much they desired and regretted the Gracchi, for they had statues of the two brothers made and set up in public places, and the spots on which they fell were declared sacred ground, to which people brought all the first fruits of the seasons, and many persons daily offered sacrifices there and worshipped, just as at the temples of the gods. Cornelia is said to have borne her misfortunes with a noble and elevated spirit, and to have said of the sacred ground on which her sons were murdered, that they had a tomb worthy of them. She resided in the neighborhood of Misenum, without making any change in her usual mode of life. She had many friends, and her hospitable table was always crowded with guests. Greeks and learned men were constantly about her, and kings sent and received presents from her. To all her visitors and friends she was a most agreeable companion. She would tell them of the life and habits of her father Africanus, and, what is most surprising, would speak of her sons without showing sorrow or shedding a tear, relating their sufferings and their deeds to her inquiring friends, as if she was speaking of the men of olden times. This made some think that her understanding had been impaired by old age or the greatness of her sorrows, and that she was dull to all sense of her misfortunes, while in fact such people themselves were too dull to see what a support it is against grief to have a noble nature, and to be of honorable lineage and honorably bred, and that though fortune has often the advantage over virtue in its attempts to guard against evils, yet she cannot take away from virtue the power of enduring them with fortitude.